Margaret Chun sat on the hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, her weathered hands clutching a small plastic bag that held her only possessions. Inside the bag was a faded photograph of a young girl at a piano, a worn handkerchief, and exactly $14 in crumpled bills. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because she wanted to be, but because the holding cell had been too cold and noisy to sleep. The courthouse buzzed with activity around her. Lawyers in expensive suits walked past, their leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. They carried thick briefcases and spoke in important voices about cases that would make headlines. None of them looked at Margaret. To them, she was invisible, just another face in the crowd of people who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Margaret pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The courthouse air conditioning was set too high, and her simple dress offered little protection against the cold. She had bought this dress from a thrift store 3 years ago for $12. It was the nicest thing she owned, navy blue with small white flowers. She had washed it carefully the night before in the tiny sink of her studio apartment, hanging it on a plastic hanger to dry overnight. The charges against her were serious: breaking and entering, trespassing on private property, destruction of valuable property. When the police officer had read them to her 2 weeks ago, the words had felt like heavy stones dropping into her chest. She understood what they meant in simple terms. Someone had accused her of breaking into a place she shouldn't have been and destroying something expensive. The Whitmore Conservatory was the most prestigious music school in the city. Its red brick building sat on perfectly manicured grounds, surrounded by tall iron gates that kept the outside world away. Rich families sent their children there to learn violin, piano, and other instruments that Margaret could barely afford to look at, let alone touch. The yearly tuition cost more than she made in 5 years of cleaning office buildings. Margaret had worked as a janitor for 38 years. She started when she was 24, fresh off the boat from another country where things had been difficult and dangerous. In America, she thought, she could build a new life. She could use the talents she had been born with. But life had other plans. Every night for the past 15 years, she had cleaned the offices at downtown businesses. She emptied trash cans, mopped floors, and wiped down desks where important people made important decisions during the day. She worked alone, moving quietly through empty hallways like a ghost. The work was hard on her knees and back, but it paid enough to keep her small apartment and put food on her table. 3 months ago, everything changed. A cleaning company told her they were cutting costs. Younger workers could do the job faster. They said they gave her 2 weeks' notice and a handshake. After 38 years of faithful service, she was unemployed with no savings and no prospects. That's when she started walking past the Whitmore Conservatory on her way to look for work. The building called to her in a way she couldn't explain. Through the tall windows, she could see beautiful instruments and hear faint sounds of music lessons. Sometimes she would stop on the sidewalk and listen to students practicing. The music made her heart ache with memories she had tried to forget. The conservatory had a janitor position open. The pay was terrible, worse than what she had been making, but Margaret needed work. The head of maintenance, a kind man named Robert, hired her without asking too many questions. He could see she was desperate, and the building needed someone who would take care of it properly. For 2 months, Margaret cleaned the conservatory with a care and attention that surprised everyone. She polished the brass fixtures until they gleamed. She treated every surface like it was precious. When she cleaned around the pianos, she moved with unusual gentleness, as if she understood their value in ways that went beyond money. The other workers noticed her behavior, but didn't think much of it. She was just a thorough cleaner, they figured. They had no idea that Margaret knew exactly what she was looking at when she saw those instruments. They didn't know that her hands remembered things her mind tried to forget. The night that changed everything was a Tuesday in October. Margaret had finished her regular cleaning duties and was about to leave when she heard something that stopped her in her tracks. Someone was playing piano in the main concert hall, and they were playing it badly. Very badly. She followed the sound down the marble hallway, her soft-soled shoes making no noise. The concert hall doors were slightly open, and she could see a young student struggling with a piece that Margaret recognized immediately. The student was hitting wrong notes, ignoring the tempo, and completely missing the emotion that the music was meant to convey. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching and listening. Her heart broke a little more with each wrong note. This was music that deserved better. Music that demanded respect and understanding. She had to bite her lip to keep from calling out corrections. The student finally gave up in frustration, slamming the piano lid shut with a bang that made Margaret wince. The instrument was worth more than most people's houses, and it was being treated like a toy. The student gathered their books and left through a side door, turning off most of the lights but leaving the hall partially illuminated. Margaret knew she should leave. Her shift was over, and she had no business being in the concert hall, but something pulled her forward. Her feet moved without her permission, carrying her down the carpeted aisle toward the stage where the magnificent Steinway grand piano sat waiting. She had been around pianos for 2 months now, but never this close to one so beautiful. The wood was polished to a mirror finish. The keys were perfectly white and black, not a smudge or fingerprint on them. Everything about it spoke of quality and craftsmanship that existed in a world far above her own. Margaret looked around the empty hall. Security cameras watched from the corners, but she told herself she was just cleaning. She had every right to be here. She pulled out her cleaning cloth and began wiping down the piano bench, then the sides of the instrument. Her movements were reverent, almost worshipful. Then, almost without thinking, she sat down on the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys for a long moment. She knew she shouldn't touch them. She was just a janitor. This instrument was for trained musicians, for people who belonged in places like this, but her hands remembered things that her mind had buried. They remembered the feel of keys under her fingers, the weight of them, the way they responded to different types of touch. Before she could stop herself, she pressed down on middle C. The sound that came from the piano was perfect, pure and clear and beautiful in a way that made her eyes fill with tears. She pressed another key, then another. Soon, her hands were moving across the keyboard like they had never forgotten, playing music that came from somewhere deep inside her soul. She lost track of time. The music flowed through her like water through a broken dam. All the years of silence, all the nights she had fallen asleep, humming melodies she couldn't play, all the longing she had buried under necessity and survival, it all came pouring out through her fingers. When she finally stopped, the hall was completely quiet. She sat there for a moment, breathing hard, wondering what she had just done. Then she heard the footsteps. The footsteps belonged to Gerald Morrison, the night security guard. He was a large man with tired eyes who had worked at the conservatory for 12 years. When he found Margaret sitting at the piano, his first thought wasn't to arrest her. His first thought was confusion. In all his years walking these halls, he had never heard music like that coming from the concert hall after hours. Gerald had heard plenty of students practice over the years. Good ones, bad ones, and everything in between. But what he heard that night was different. It was professional level playing, the kind you might hear at Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center, the kind that made you stop what you were doing and just listen. When Margaret saw him standing in the doorway, she immediately stood up and stepped away from the piano. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. She knew she was in trouble, big trouble. "Ma'am," Gerald said quietly, "you're not supposed to be in here." Margaret nodded and gathered her cleaning supplies. She couldn't find words to explain what had happened. How could she tell this man that something inside her had taken over? That for 30 minutes she had forgotten who she was supposed to be and remembered who she used to be? Gerald should have called the police right away. That was protocol. But something about the whole situation bothered him. This woman was clearly just a cleaning lady. Her clothes, her nervous behavior, everything about her screamed working class. Yet she had just played piano like a concertmaster. "How did you learn to play like that?" he asked. Margaret just shook her head and walked toward the exit. She couldn't answer that question. Not without opening doors she had spent decades keeping locked. Gerald watched her go, then walked over to the piano. He ran his fingers along the keys she had just been playing. Everything looked normal, nothing was damaged or out of place. If anything, the piano looked cleaner than usual. But 3 days later, the conservatory director, Dr. Harrison Webb, received an anonymous phone call. Someone claimed they had seen the cleaning lady messing with the expensive piano after hours. The caller suggested that Dr. Webb check the security footage and make sure nothing had been stolen or damaged. Dr. Webb was a nervous man who worried constantly about the conservatory's reputation and insurance policies. The Steinway piano was worth $2.3 million. It was the crown jewel of the school, used only for the most important performances and lessons. The thought of an untrained janitor touching it made his stomach churn. He pulled the security footage immediately. There was Margaret, clear as day, sitting at the piano and playing for over 30 minutes. To Dr. Webb, it didn't matter that she played beautifully. What mattered was that she had violated trust, broken rules, and potentially put an irreplaceable instrument at risk. Within hours, Margaret was arrested at her apartment. The charges were serious: criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and theft of services. Dr. Webb claimed that her unauthorized use of the piano constituted stealing expensive lesson time. The arrest made the local news. "Janitor accused of breaking into elite music school" was the headline that ran in the city paper. The story painted Margaret as a delusional woman who thought she could play piano like a professional. It quoted Dr. Webb saying that untrained individuals can cause thousands of dollars in damage to delicate instruments. That's how Harold Fleming first heard about the case. Harold was a successful businessman who owned 3 car dealerships and a small chain of restaurants. He was the kind of man who was used to getting his way and having his opinions matter. At 61 years old, he had built his fortune through determination, smart investments, and a willingness to step on anyone who got in his way. Harold read the newspaper story over his morning coffee and laughed out loud. The whole thing struck him as ridiculous. A cleaning lady who thought she could play classical piano? It was like something out of a bad movie. When Harold received his jury duty notice 2 weeks later, he almost threw it in the trash. He was too important for jury duty. He had businesses to run, deals to make, money to earn. But his lawyer advised him that serving on a jury might be good for his public image. It would show that he was a civic-minded citizen who cared about justice. Harold agreed to serve, but only after making it clear to everyone around him that he considered it a waste of his valuable time. The day of jury selection was a circus. The courthouse was packed with potential jurors from all walks of life. Teachers, shop workers, retirees, students, office workers, and business people all sat together in the large assembly room waiting to be called. Harold made no effort to blend in. He wore his most expensive suit, a navy blue piece that cost more than most people made in a month. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. His watch was a Rolex that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. From the moment he walked into the courthouse, Harold made his opinions known. He spoke loudly on his phone about business deals, making sure everyone around him knew he was important. When other potential jurors tried to make small talk, he responded with comments about how he didn't have time for this nonsense. During the selection process, the lawyers asked questions to determine if jurors could be fair and impartial. When they got to Harold, he didn't even try to hide his bias. "This whole case is a joke," he said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "We're supposed to take seriously the idea that some cleaning lady is a piano player? Come on, this is a waste of taxpayer money." The prosecutor, Jennifer Walsh, was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in property crimes. She liked Harold immediately. His obvious disdain for the defendant would work in her favor. The defense attorney, Thomas Rivera, was a young public defender who had been assigned to Margaret's case. He was fresh out of law school and overwhelmed by his caseload. He wanted to dismiss Harold from the jury, but he had already used up his allowed challenges on other problematic jurors. "Mr. Fleming," the judge said, "can you set aside your personal opinions and judge this case based only on the evidence presented?" Harold straightened his tie and smiled. Your Honor, I'm a businessman. I deal in facts, not fantasies. If the evidence shows this woman committed a crime, I'll vote to convict. If it doesn't, I won't. But I'm not going to pretend that some janitor is secretly a concert pianist just because her lawyer says so. Several other potential jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harold's attitude was making everyone nervous, but legally there was nothing wrong with his answer. He had committed to following the evidence, which was all the law required. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, listening to Harold's comments with growing dread. She could see the contempt in his eyes when he looked at her. To him, she wasn't a person with a story worth hearing. She was just a problem to be solved, a pest to be dealt with quickly so he could get back to his important life. Thomas Rivera leaned over and whispered to Margaret, "Don't worry about him. Juries sometimes surprise you. We just need to tell your story." But Margaret knew better. She had spent her whole life being invisible to people like Harold Fleming. Rich, powerful men who saw the world in simple terms, winners and losers, valuable people and disposable ones. In Harold's world, cleaning ladies didn't play piano, and anyone who suggested otherwise was living in a fantasy. The jury selection continued for another hour, but the damage was already done. Harold Fleming was selected as juror number 7, and his attitude had influenced several other jurors. Margaret could see it in their faces. They looked at her the same way Harold did, like she was wasting their time with impossible claims. As the potential jurors were dismissed for lunch break, Harold made sure to walk past Margaret's table. He didn't say anything, but his message was clear. He had already made up his mind about her guilt, and nothing her young lawyer could say was going to change it. Margaret watched him leave, her heart sinking. She had thought the worst part would be proving she hadn't damaged the piano. Now she realized the real challenge would be convincing people like Harold that she was worth listening to at all. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in late November. Margaret sat beside her lawyer Thomas Rivera, wearing the same navy dress she had worn to jury selection. She had washed it again the night before, her hands shaking as she hung it up to dry. This dress had become her armor, the only thing that made her feel slightly prepared for the battle ahead. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected. She had imagined something grand like the ones on television, but this was just a plain room with wooden benches, fluorescent lights, and windows that needed cleaning. About 30 people sat in the gallery, mostly law students and curious locals, who had nothing better to do on a weekday morning. Judge Patricia Coleman was a woman in her late 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. She had been on the bench for 15 years and had seen every type of case imaginable. When she looked at Margaret, she didn't see a criminal. She saw a frightened woman who clearly didn't belong in a courtroom, but judges had to follow the law, not their instincts. The charges against Margaret were serious, and if the prosecution could prove their case, she would face real consequences. Possible jail time, heavy fines, and a criminal record that would make finding work even harder than it already was. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh stood up to give her opening statement. She was dressed in a sharp black suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had won many cases like this one. Her voice was clear and strong as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "this is a simple case about respect for the law and other people's property. The defendant, Margaret Chun, deliberately broke into the Whitmore Conservatory. After hours and used a priceless piano without permission, she violated the trust placed in her as an employee and potentially damaged an instrument worth more than most people will earn in their entire lifetime." Harold Fleming sat in the jury box, nodding along with every word. He had been chosen as the jury foreman, which surprised no one. His commanding presence and business experience made him a natural leader. Even when that leadership came with a heavy dose of prejudice, Jennifer Walsh clicked a remote control, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming," she continued. "We have security footage that clearly shows the defendant entering the concert hall at 11:47 p.m. on October 15th. We have photographs of damage to the piano discovered the following morning. And we have witness testimony from multiple people who heard unauthorized activity in the building that night. The first piece of evidence was devastating. The security. Footage showed Margaret walking down the hallway toward the concert hall. The timestamp was clear, 11:47 p.m. She moved slowly, but deliberately, carrying her cleaning supplies. The camera angle made her look sneaky, even though she was just doing her job. The next clip showed her entering the concert hall. Here, the footage became more damaging. Instead of cleaning and leaving quickly, Margaret could be seen approaching the piano. The camera was too far away to show exactly what she was doing, but it was clear she was interacting with the instrument for an extended period. As you can see, Jennifer Walsh explained, the defendant spent 37 minutes in that concert hall. No cleaning task requires that amount of time in a single room. The defendant was clearly using the piano for her own purposes, violating her employment agreement and trespassing on property she had no right to access after her shift ended. Thomas Rivera watched the footage with a sinking heart. He had seen it before during case preparation, but watching it again in front of the jury made his client look even more guilty. The young lawyer knew he was in over his head. This was only his 15th case as a public defender, and he was up against one of the district attorney's most experienced prosecutors. The prosecution's next exhibit was even worse. Jennifer Walsh displayed a series of photographs showing the Steinway piano the morning after Margaret's midnight visit. To an untrained eye, the images were shocking. These photographs were taken by Dr. Harrison Webb, the conservatory director. At approximately 8 a.m. on October 16th, Walsh explained, notice the condition of the piano strings here and here. See these marks on the soundboard? This damage was not present when the instrument was inspected the previous evening. The photos showed what appeared to be scratches and scuff marks on the piano's interior. Some of the strings looked loose or misaligned. The wooden soundboard had several small marks that could have been damage or could have been shadows from the camera flash. To a jury of non-musicians, it looked like clear evidence of vandalism. Harold Fleming leaned forward in his chair, studying the photographs with the intensity of a detective. This is exactly what I expected, he whispered to the juror sitting next to him, a retired teacher named Dorothy Kim. Some people have no respect for beautiful things. Dorothy wasn't so sure. The damage in the photos seemed minor, almost cosmetic. She had taught elementary school for 30 years and had seen real vandalism. Kids who were angry or destructive left obvious damage. This looked different, but she kept her thoughts to herself. Harold's confidence was intimidating, and she didn't want to seem foolish. The prosecution called Dr. Harrison Webb as their first witness. Dr. Webb was a thin man with nervous energy who spoke quickly and gestured with his hands. He had run the Whitmore Conservatory for 8 years and took his responsibilities very seriously. Dr. Webb, Jennifer Walsh asked, can you tell the jury about the value of the piano in question? Certainly, Dr. Webb replied, adjusting his glasses. The Steinway Model D Concert Grand is worth approximately $2.3 million. It was purchased by the conservatory in 1987 and has been maintained in perfect condition ever since. We use it only for our most advanced students and professional performances. How delicate is an instrument like this? Extremely delicate, Dr. Webb said, his voice rising slightly. The strings are under tremendous tension. The soundboard is made of specially selected wood that can crack if handled improperly. Even trained pianists can cause damage if they play too aggressively or without proper technique. Harold Fleming nodded approvingly. This made perfect sense to him. Expensive things required careful handling by trained professionals. You wouldn't let a random person drive a Ferrari or perform surgery. Why would you let a janitor play $1 million piano? Thomas Rivera stood up for cross-examination. He was nervous, but he knew this was his chance to poke holes in the prosecution's case. Dr. Webb, he began, you mentioned that the piano requires careful handling. Have you ever had it damaged by students before? Well, yes, occasionally there are minor incidents. How many times in the past year? Dr. Webb shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps 6 or 7 times. But those were students who had been properly trained, and how much did those repairs cost? Usually between $50 and $200. But that's completely different from Dr. Webb. Did you actually have the piano examined by a professional technician after this alleged incident? The question hit its mark. Dr. Webb's face flushed slightly. We scheduled an appointment, but the technician said it would take several weeks to get on his calendar. We decided to wait until after the trial to avoid any additional costs. Thomas Rivera felt a small surge of hope. So you have no professional assessment of whether any actual damage occurred? The photographs clearly show. The photographs show marks that could be anything, couldn't they? Dust, shadows, normal wear and tear. Jennifer Walsh objected, and Judge Coleman sustained it, but the point had been made. The prosecution's evidence of damage was less solid than it appeared. The next witness was Gerald Morrison, the security guard who had discovered Margaret. Gerald took the stand reluctantly. He liked Margaret and didn't want to hurt her case, but he had to tell the truth about what he saw. "Mr. Morrison," Jennifer Walsh asked, "please tell the jury what you observed on the night of October 15th. Gerald cleared his throat. "I was doing my regular patrol around midnight when I heard piano music coming from the concert hall. It was well, it was beautiful music, professional quality. I thought maybe one of the advanced students had permission to practice late. What did you find when you investigated?" "I found the defendant sitting at the piano. She was playing, and she was playing very well. Better than most of the students I've heard over the years." Harold Fleming's eyebrows shot up. This wasn't what he expected to hear. The security guard was supposed to be describing a crime, not praising the defendants. Musical ability. Jennifer Walsh quickly moved to control the damage. "Mr. Morrison, regardless of how well she played, was the defendant authorized to be in that room?" "No, ma'am. Her shift had ended, and employees aren't supposed to use the instruments." "Did she seem surprised when you discovered her?" "Yes, she looked scared. She knew she wasn't supposed to be there." Thomas Rivera's cross-examination focused on Gerald's assessment of Margaret's playing. "Mr. Morrison, you said the defendant played at a professional level. How many professional pianists have you heard perform?" "Quite a few over the years. The conservatory hosts concerts regularly, and I've worked security for many of them." "In your opinion, did the defendant play like someone who had never touched a piano before?" The lunch break felt like the longest hour of Margaret's life. She sat in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse with Thomas Rivera, picking at a sandwich she couldn't taste. Her stomach was too twisted with nerves to eat properly. The morning had gone worse than she had feared. Every piece of evidence made her look more guilty, more foolish, more like exactly what everyone believed her to be, a confused woman who had overstepped her boundaries. Thomas was spread out across the table with file folders, legal pads covered in notes, and copies of law books open to various pages. He had been working on Margaret's case for 3 weeks, but he felt like he was drowning. The prosecution had built a solid case that would be difficult to overcome with traditional legal arguments. "Margaret," he said quietly, not looking up. "From his papers, we need to talk about your background. I know you don't want to discuss your past, but after this morning, I don't think we have a choice." Margaret set down her sandwich and folded her hands in her lap. She had been dreading this conversation since the day she was arrested. Thomas had asked her repeatedly about her musical training, but she had always deflected or given vague answers. The truth was too painful, too complicated, and too hard to believe. "I've told you everything you need to know," she said softly. "I can play piano. I learned when I was young. That's all that matters." Thomas finally looked up at her, his young face showing the strain of the morning's proceedings. "No, Margaret, that's not all that matters. Gerald Morrison testified that you play at a professional level. Dr. Foster said it would take years of training to develop that kind of skill. The jury is confused because none of this makes sense with your current situation." Margaret stared at the table. How could she explain 40 years of hiding, 40 years of pretending to be someone she wasn't? How could she make him understand the choices she had made and the reasons she had made them? "If I tell them who I used to be," she said finally. They won't believe it. People like Harold Fleming, they see a janitor and that's all they can see. My past won't change what I am to them now. Thomas leaned forward, his voice urgent. But it might explain why you were in that concert hall. It might make the jury understand that you weren't trying to steal or vandalize anything. You were just playing music. Before Margaret could respond, a bailiff knocked on the door. Lunch was over and court was resuming. They walked back into the courtroom together, Margaret's heart pounding with each step. The afternoon session began with Thomas Rivera standing to present the defense's case. He was nervous, sweating slightly despite the air conditioning. This was the moment when he would either save his client or watch her conviction become inevitable. Your Honor, he began, the defense calls Margaret Chun to the stand. A murmur went through the courtroom. Defendants didn't always testify in their own cases, especially when the evidence seemed so clear-cut. Margaret walked slowly to the witness stand, her legs feeling unsteady. The bailiff swore her in, and she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thomas started with basic questions about her employment at the conservatory, her duties as a janitor and her work schedule. Margaret answered in a quiet voice, barely audible even with the microphone. She described her routine, her responsibilities, and her dedication to doing a good job. Margaret, Thomas asked, on the night of October 15th, why did you go to the concert hall? Margaret took a deep breath. I heard someone playing piano. They were playing badly. Very badly. It was a piece I recognized, and it was being played all wrong. I wanted to see what was happening. What did you do when you got to the concert hall? I watched for a while. The student was struggling with the music. They were hitting wrong notes and ignoring the tempo. Finally, they gave up and left. And then what happened? Margaret's voice became even quieter. I should have left too. I know that, but the piano was there and it was so beautiful. I had been working around pianos for months, cleaning them but never touching them. That night, something inside me just broke. Jennifer Walsh was preparing to object, but Harold Fleming beat her to it. He stood up in the jury box, his face red with frustration. Your Honor, Harold called out, ignoring proper courtroom protocol, this is ridiculous. We're supposed to believe that a janitor suddenly became a piano expert because she heard bad music? This woman is making up stories to avoid responsibility for her actions. Judge Coleman banged her gavel sharply. Mr. Fleming, you will sit down immediately. Jurors do not speak during testimony unless specifically asked to do so. But Harold was too worked up to stop. Judge, with all due respect, this is a waste of everyone's time. This woman broke the law, period. She trespassed, she used property that didn't belong to her, and now she's telling fairy tales to get out of trouble. Mr. Fleming, if you do not sit down right now, I will hold you in contempt of court. Harold finally sat, but he continued, shaking his head and muttering under his breath. His outburst had exactly the effect he intended. Several other jurors were nodding in agreement. The idea that Margaret had any legitimate claim to musical expertise seemed absurd to them. Thomas tried to continue with his questioning, but the damage was done. Margaret looked even smaller and more frightened on the witness stand. Harold's interruption had broken her concentration and reminded everyone in the room that she was supposed to be a simple cleaning lady with simple problems. Margaret, Thomas said gently, can you tell the jury about your musical background? I learned to play when I was very young, Margaret answered, her voice barely a whisper. In another country, before I came to America. What kind of training did you receive? Margaret hesitated. This was the moment of truth. The point where she would either reveal everything or continue hiding behind vague answers. She looked at the jury and saw skeptical faces staring back at her. Harold Fleming was practically glaring at her, his arms crossed and his expression dismissive. I studied classical piano, she said finally. I was accepted to a conservatory when I was 8 years old. Jennifer Walsh stood up to object. Your Honor, there's no evidence to support these claims. The defendant can't just make up a musical background to justify her criminal behavior. Judge Coleman looked troubled. Mr. Rivera, do you have any documentation to support your client's claims about her musical training? Thomas shuffled through, his papers looking desperate. Your Honor, my client's educational records were lost when she immigrated to America. However, her musical ability speaks for itself. If the court would allow a demonstration, Harold Fleming couldn't contain himself any longer. He stood up again, this time with a loud laugh that echoed through the courtroom. A demonstration? He said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Your Honor, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. This woman is a janitor. She cleans toilets and empties trash cans for a living. Now, we're supposed to believe she's some kind of hidden concert pianist? Judge Coleman banged her gavel repeatedly. Mr. Fleming, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please remove the juror from the courtroom. But Harold wasn't finished. As the bailiff approached him, he turned to address the entire courtroom, his voice booming with confidence and condescension. You know what? He declared, pointing directly at Margaret. If this woman can actually perform piano at a professional level, if she can prove that she has the training and skill she claims to have, I'll retire from my position as a successful businessman and donate my entire fortune to charity. Every penny of it. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Harold's challenge was so extreme, so public, that it couldn't be taken back. He had essentially bet his entire life's work on his belief that Margaret was lying about her abilities. How confident I am, Harold continued, even as the bailiff reached his side, that this whole story is complete nonsense. Professional pianists don't work as janitors. Conservatory graduates don't sneak into buildings to play music. This woman is either delusional or she's a very good liar, but she is definitely not a trained musician. Judge Coleman was furious. Mr. Fleming, you will be removed from this jury immediately. Your behavior is completely unacceptable and— No, wait, Harold interrupted, holding up his hand. I want to stay on this jury. I want to see this so-called demonstration. I want to watch this woman try to prove something that we all know is impossible. Because when she fails, and she will fail, maybe everyone in this room will stop wasting time on this ridiculous charade. The judge looked at the lawyers, both of whom seemed stunned by the turn of events. Jennifer Walsh was actually pleased with Harold's outburst. His challenge had made Margaret's claims seem even more unbelievable. If she tried to demonstrate her musical ability and failed, the case would be over immediately. Thomas Rivera, on the other hand, saw an unexpected opportunity. Harold's public challenge had raised the stakes dramatically. If Margaret could actually prove her musical abilities, the impact would be enormous. The problem was that he still didn't know if she really could play at the level she claimed. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly, my client accepts Mr. Fleming's challenge. We request permission to demonstrate her musical abilities in a controlled setting. During the recess, Thomas Rivera sat alone in the conference room, staring at a manila folder he had been afraid to open. Inside were documents that would change everything about Margaret's case, but using them meant exposing secrets that his client had spent decades protecting. He had discovered these papers 3 days ago, buried in immigration records that took weeks to locate. Now he had to decide whether to save Margaret's case or respect her privacy. The folder contained photocopied newspaper clippings from 1979 and 1980, all written in Russian with English translations attached. The headlines told an incredible story. 8-year-old piano prodigy stuns Moscow Conservatory. Young Magdalena Chernova called once-in-a-generation talent. Child pianist performs with Moscow Philharmonic. The photographs accompanying the articles showed a small girl with dark hair and serious eyes, sitting at a grand piano that seemed too large for her tiny frame. But even in the grainy black and white images, her confidence was unmistakable. This was not a child playing dress-up. This was a young artist who belonged on that stage. Thomas had spent hours staring at those photos, comparing them to the frightened woman sitting in his conference room. The facial features were the same, but everything else had changed. The confident child had become an invisible adult. The celebrated prodigy had become a forgotten janitor. He had tried to discuss these documents with Margaret several times, but she always shut down the conversation. She would look away, change the subject, or simply say that the past didn't matter anymore. But now, with Harold Fleming's challenge hanging over the case, the past was the only thing that could save her. Thomas walked back to the conference room where Margaret was waiting. She sat with her hands folded, staring out the window at the gray November sky. She looked smaller than ever, like a person who had spent so long trying to disappear that she had almost succeeded. "Margaret," Thomas said softly, placing the folder on the table between them, "we need to talk about Moscow." Margaret's entire body tensed. She didn't look at the folder, but she knew what it contained. She had lived in fear of this moment for 45 years, terrified that someone would discover who she used to be and force her to explain why she had given it all up. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. Thomas opened the folder and spread the newspaper clippings across the table. "Maria Magdalena Chernova," he read from one of the headlines. 8 years old when she made her debut with the Moscow Conservatory. Considered one of the most promising young pianists in the Soviet Union, called a musical genius by critics who had never seen anything like her. Margaret finally looked at the papers, and her eyes filled with tears. Seeing those photographs again was like looking at a different person, someone she had been in another lifetime. The little girl in the pictures had believed that music was everything, that talent and hard work were enough to build a life on. She had been so naive. "That was a long time ago," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "That person doesn't exist anymore." "But she does," Thomas insisted. "She's sitting right here." "Margaret, these articles describe your performances in detail. You played pieces that professional pianists struggle with. You were invited to perform with orchestras across Europe. You were being called the next great classical pianist." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "And then my parents decided to leave Russia. They said it wasn't safe anymore, that we needed to start over in America. They promised me I could continue my music studies here. They promised me nothing would change. What happened when you got to America?" The question opened a floodgate of memories that Margaret had tried to suppress for decades. She had been 11 years old when her family arrived in New York with nothing but 2 suitcases and a desperate hope for a better life. Her father had been a literature professor in Moscow, her mother a translator. In America, they became a dishwasher and a factory worker, struggling to survive in a country where their education and experience meant nothing. "We had no money," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as the story poured out. "No connections, no family to help us. My parents spoke broken English, and I spoke none at all. They had spent everything they had just to get us out of Russia. There was no money for piano lessons, no money for a piano, no money for anything, except food and rent." Thomas listened intently, finally understanding the tragedy that had shaped his client's life. "Did you try to continue your music education?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "I tried everything. I went to music schools and conservatories, begging for scholarships or free lessons. I played for admissions committees and teachers, showing them newspaper clippings about my performances in Moscow. Do you know what they told me?" "What?" "They said the articles were fake. They said it was impossible for a child from Russia to have that level of training. They looked at my clothes, heard my parents' accents, and decided we were lying." In 1982, nobody wanted to believe that Soviet musicians could be as good as American ones. The Cold War made everything political, even music. Thomas was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened to Margaret. She hadn't just lost her career. She had lost her entire identity. The world had refused to believe she was who she claimed to be, forcing her to become someone else entirely. "So, what did you do?" "I adapted," Margaret said simply. "I learned English as fast as I could. I helped my parents find work. I went to regular school and pretended to be a normal teenager, but at night I would find pianos wherever I could. Churches, community centers, schools after hours. I would sneak in and play just to remember who I used to be." "How long did you keep that up?" years into my 20s, even into my 30s. But it got harder as I got older. Security got better, and I got caught a few times. Eventually, I realized I was just torturing myself. The music world had moved on without me. I wasn't 11 years old anymore. I was just another adult with impossible dreams. Thomas felt deep sadness for his client. She had been forced to bury the most important part of herself just to survive in a new country. Margaret, why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? This changes everything about your case. Margaret shook her head. Because it doesn't matter. Look at Harold Fleming's face when he looks at me. Look at the jury. They see exactly what everyone has seen for the past 40 years. A poor immigrant woman who cleans buildings for a living. Even if they believe these old newspaper articles are real, they'll just think it's sad that I never got over losing my childhood dreams. But the security footage shows you playing at a professional level. Gerald Morrison testified that you sounded like a concert pianist. This evidence proves that their testimony was accurate. Or it proves that I'm a crazy old woman who still thinks she's 11 years old, Margaret replied. Harold Fleming has already made up his mind. He thinks this is all an elaborate lie, and when I fail to live up to his impossible expectations, he'll feel vindicated. Thomas gathered the newspaper clippings and put them back in the folder. Margaret, I'm going to present this evidence whether you want me to or not. You're facing jail time and a criminal record. These articles prove that you have legitimate musical training and that your presence in that concert hall wasn't random. Vandalism, it was a musician reconnecting with her art. Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. These were the same hands that had once made beautiful music, that had been praised by critics and audiences across Europe. Now they were calloused from years of cleaning, marked by decades of manual labor. Could they still make music? Did they remember what her mind had tried so hard to forget? If I agree to this, she said finally, if I let you tell them who I used to be, what happens when they ask me to prove it? What if Harold Fleming demands that demonstration he challenged me to? Thomas leaned forward. Then you'll have to decide if you're ready to be Maria Magdalena Trinova again, even if it's just for a few minutes. The bailiff knocked on the door, signaling that the recess was over. Margaret stood up slowly, her decision made. She had spent 45 years hiding from her past. Maybe it was time to face it, even if it meant risking everything on abilities she wasn't sure she still possessed. Okay, she said quietly. Tell them who I was. But Thomas, you need to understand something. The little girl in those newspaper articles was fearless. She believed that music was the most important thing in the world, and she was willing to risk everything for it. I'm not that person anymore. I'm scared, and I'm old, and I don't know if my hands remember what my heart has never forgotten. Thomas picked up the folder and walked toward the courtroom door. Margaret, being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. Sometimes it means you're about to do something that really matters. As they walked back into the courtroom, Margaret felt the weight of 4 decades of silence pressing down on her shoulders. Harold Fleming sat in the jury box with a smug expression, confident that he had called her bluff. The other jurors looked curious but skeptical. Judge Coleman appeared concerned about the unusual turn the case had taken. Margaret took her seat at the defendant's table, knowing that the next hour would determine whether she would finally reclaim her identity or lose it forever. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed completely. Word of Harold Fleming's dramatic challenge had spread through the courthouse during the break. Extra spectators had slipped into the gallery, including several court employees who had heard about the unusual case. Even Judge Coleman seemed more alert, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Thomas Rivera stood up with the manila folder in his hands, his nervousness replaced by determination. He had spent the last 20 minutes of recess making photocopies of the most important documents and preparing translations for the jury. This was his moment to turn the entire case around. Your Honor, Thomas began, the defense would like to present new evidence that directly relates to the defendant's background and explains her actions on the night in question. Jennifer Walsh immediately objected. Your Honor, the prosecution was not given advance notice of any new evidence. This appears to be a deliberate ambush tactic. Judge Coleman looked thoughtful. Mr. Rivera, why wasn't this evidence presented during discovery? Your Honor, my client was reluctant to discuss her past due to its painful nature. It was only after this morning's proceedings and Mr. Fleming's public challenge that she agreed to allow me to present this information. Harold Fleming rolled his eyes dramatically from the jury box. More fairy tales, he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. How convenient that this evidence only appears when she's backed into a corner. Judge Coleman shot Harold a warning look. Mr. Fleming, one more outburst and you will be removed from this jury permanently. I don't care how much money you've bet on this case. Thomas opened the folder and pulled out the first newspaper clipping. He approached the jury box, holding up the 45-year-old article so they could see the photograph of the young girl at the piano. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, I want you to look carefully at this photograph. This is a newspaper article from Pravda, the official newspaper of the Soviet Union, dated March 15, 1979. The headline reads, In Russian, 8-year-old piano prodigy amazes Moscow Conservatory. He handed the translated article to the jury. Foreman Harold, who took it with obvious skepticism. Harold glanced at the photograph, then at Margaret, then back at the photograph. For the first time since the trial began, he looked uncertain. The child in this photograph, Thomas continued, is Maria Magdalena Chernova, age 8. She had just become the youngest student ever accepted to the Moscow Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world, critics called her a once-in-a-generation talent and predicted she would become one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century. Dorothy Kim, the retired teacher sitting next to Harold, studied the photograph carefully. Even in the grainy black and white image, she could see the resemblance to Margaret. The eyes were the same, and there was something about the way the child held herself that matched the defendant's posture. Thomas presented more articles, each one documenting Maria's rise as a child prodigy. There were reviews of her performances with the Moscow Philharmonic, photographs of her meeting with Soviet officials, and interviews with her teachers praising her extraordinary abilities. By age 10, Thomas explained, Maria had performed in concert halls across Eastern Europe. She was being compared to legendary pianists like Vladimir Horowitz and Arthur Rubinstein. Her future seemed limitless. Harold Fleming was studying the documents more carefully now, his confident expression beginning to crack. The newspaper articles looked authentic, with the proper fonts, layouts, and paper aging that would be nearly impossible to fake. The photographs showed the same facial features as the defendant, just decades younger. Your Honor, Jennifer Walsh interrupted, even if these documents are authentic, they don't change the facts of this case. The defendant still trespassed on private property and used an expensive instrument without permission. Thomas nodded. You're absolutely right. Ms. Walsh, these documents don't change what happened on October 15th, but they do explain why it happened. And they prove that Margaret Chun and Maria Magdalena Chernova are the same person. He turned back to the jury. In 1982, when Maria was 11 years old, her family fled the Soviet Union. Like many immigrants, they came to America with nothing but hope for a better life. Her father had been a university professor, her mother a translator. In America, they became a dishwasher and a factory worker, struggling to survive in a new country where their education meant nothing. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, tears streaming down her face as her lawyer told the story she had kept hidden for so long. She watched the jurors' faces, seeing confusion, sympathy, and in Harold's case, growing discomfort with his earlier assumptions. Maria tried desperately to continue her musical education in America, Thomas continued. She auditioned for conservatories and music schools, showing them these same newspaper articles as proof of her abilities. But this was 1982, during the height of the Cold War. American music schools didn't want to believe that a Soviet child could be as talented as their own students. Thomas pulled out a letter from the folder. This is a rejection letter from the Juilliard School, dated September 1983. It states, and I quote, while the applicant shows some musical aptitude, We cannot verify the authenticity of the provided documentation from foreign sources. We recommend that the student begin with basic lessons at a local music school. The letter hit the jury like a physical blow. Here was proof that Margaret's claims about being rejected weren't just self-pity. The most prestigious music school in America had literally refused to believe her documented achievements. Harold Fleming was reading the rejection letter with a deep frown. As a businessman, he understood the value of credentials and documentation. These newspapers and letters looked completely legitimate. More troubling, they told a story that made perfect sense. Of course, music schools would be suspicious of Soviet documentation in 1982. Of course, immigrant families would struggle financially. Of course, a talented child would be forced to give up their dreams. Thomas presented more evidence: additional rejection letters, documentation of the family's immigration status, and employment records showing Margaret's parents working in menial jobs despite their advanced education. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of a family that had sacrificed everything for freedom, including their daughter's extraordinary musical career. So what happened to Maria's music? Thomas asked the jury. Did she give up completely? No, for years she found ways to play piano wherever she could. Churches, community centers, schools after hours. She would sneak into buildings just to touch the keys, just to remember who she used to be. Margaret wiped her eyes, remembering those desperate years when music was both her salvation and her torture. Every stolen moment at a piano reminded her of what she had lost, but she couldn't stop herself from seeking them out. But as Maria got older, it became harder to find opportunities to play. Security improved. She got caught trespassing several times, and eventually she realized she was just torturing herself. So she did what millions of immigrants have done throughout American history. She buried her past and focused on survival. Thomas walked closer to the jury box, his voice becoming more passionate. For 40 years, Maria Magdalena Chernova worked as a janitor. She cleaned offices, she mopped floors, she emptied trash cans. She became invisible, just another immigrant worker doing the jobs that others didn't want. But inside, the music never died. It just waited. Harold Fleming was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The story was too detailed, too consistent, and too well documented to be fake. Worse, it was making him question everything he had assumed about Margaret. If she really was a former child prodigy, then his dismissive attitude toward her musical claims looked cruel and ignorant. 3 months ago, Thomas continued, Margaret lost her job. After 38 years of faithful service, she was laid off with 2 weeks' notice. Desperate for work, she took a position as a janitor at the Whitmore Conservatory, where she found herself surrounded by the instruments and music she had loved and lost. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the tragic story unfolding before them. On the night of October 15th, Margaret finished her cleaning duties and was about to leave when she heard something that broke her heart. A student was butchering a piece of classical music that she had once performed flawlessly as a child. She couldn't help herself. She had to see what was happening. Thomas's voice became gentler. What happened? Next wasn't vandalism or theft. It was a woman reconnecting with the most important part of herself. For 37 minutes, Margaret wasn't a janitor or an immigrant or a defendant in a criminal case. She was Maria Magdalena Chernova again, doing what she was born to do, making music. Margaret looked up at the jury and saw something she hadn't expected, understanding. Dorothy Kim was openly crying. 2 other jurors were wiping their eyes. Even some of the spectators in the gallery were emotionally affected by the story, but it was Harold Fleming's reaction that mattered most. The confident businessman who had mocked her claims and bet his fortune on her failure was staring at the newspaper articles with a stunned expression. The courthouse conference room hadn't been used for anything like this in its 40-year history. Located on the 2nd floor, it was a plain rectangular space with beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and a long wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs. In the far corner sat an old upright piano that had been donated by a local music store 15 years earlier. It was used occasionally for small ceremonies or when court employees needed a quiet place to make phone calls. Nobody had played the piano in months. A thin layer of dust covered the keys, and several of the black keys stuck when pressed. The bench wobbled slightly, and the wood finish was scratched and faded. It was about as far from a concert grand as possible, but it was all they had. Judge Coleman had made an unprecedented decision. She cleared the courtroom of all non-essential personnel, allowing only the jury, the lawyers, court staff, and a few observers to witness what was about to happen. Margaret's demonstration would be recorded by the court reporter, but the judge wanted to keep the audience small to avoid turning the proceedings into a spectacle. Margaret stood in the doorway of the conference room, staring at the old piano, with a mixture of longing and terror. Her hands were shaking and her mouth was dry. She had agreed to this demonstration in a moment of desperation, but now that it was actually happening, she felt paralyzed with fear. What if she had been lying to herself all these years? What if the music was really gone, buried too deep under? Decades of silence to ever resurface? What if she sat down at that piano and discovered that Maria Magdalena Chernova had died somewhere along the way, leaving behind only Margaret Chun, the invisible janitor? Harold Fleming entered the room behind her, and she could feel his eyes boring into her back. He had been strangely quiet since Thomas presented the newspaper evidence, but Margaret could sense his skepticism radiating like heat from a fire. He was waiting for her to fail, waiting to be proven right about his assumptions. "Miss Chun," Judge Coleman said gently, "please take your time. There's no pressure here. If you're not comfortable with this demonstration, you can withdraw the request." Margaret knew that withdrawing wasn't really an option. Harold's challenge had raised the stakes too high. If she backed down now, the jury would assume she had been lying about her abilities all along. Her credibility would be destroyed, and her conviction would be guaranteed. She walked slowly toward the piano, each step feeling like it took enormous effort. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. 12 pairs of eyes watched her every movement, waiting to see if the impossible story they had just heard could possibly be true. Margaret reached the piano bench and sat down carefully. The wooden seat creaked under her weight, and she had to adjust her position to find a stable spot. She placed her hands on her knees and stared at the dusty keys in front of her. For a moment, she was 11 years old again, sitting in a practice room at the Moscow Conservatory. She could almost hear her teacher's voice. "Magdalena, music is not about the instrument. A true musician can make beauty with anything that has keys. The piano is just wood and metal. The music comes from your heart and flows through your hands." Margaret reached out and pressed middle C. The note was slightly out of tune, but it was clear and strong. She pressed it again, listening to the way the sound filled the small room. Then she played a simple C major scale, her fingers moving slowly across the white keys. Harold Fleming crossed his arms and waited. Anyone could play a basic scale. Children learned scales in their first piano lessons. This proved nothing, but Margaret wasn't finished warming up. She played the scale again, this time faster and with more confidence. Her fingers began to remember the feel of keys beneath them. She played a few chords, testing the piano's responsiveness and getting used to its particular quirks. Thomas Rivera held his breath. He could see Margaret's posture changing as she sat at the piano. The frightened, hunched woman was gradually transforming into someone else. Her back straightened, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands began to move with more authority. Margaret closed her eyes and let her fingers find the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in A-flat major. Op. 9, No. 2. It was a piece she had learned when she was 9 years old. One of the first romantic pieces her teacher had allowed her to study. As a child, she had thought it was the most beautiful music ever written. The melody began softly, tentatively, like a whisper in the darkness. Margaret's right hand carried the main theme, while her left hand provided gentle accompaniment. The old piano responded better than anyone had expected, its worn hammers still capable of producing warm, expressive tones. As the music continued, Margaret's confidence grew. Her fingers remembered exactly where to go, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to speed up and when to slow down. The years of silence hadn't erased the music from her muscle memory. It had just been waiting for permission to emerge. Dorothy. Kim felt tears streaming down her face. She had taught elementary school for 30 years, and she had heard hundreds of children attempt to play piano. But this was something entirely different. This was the sound of someone who had been born to make music, someone for whom the piano was as natural as breathing. Harold Fleming uncrossed his arms. The Chopin Nocturne was not an easy piece. It required technical skill, musical understanding, and years of training to play properly. Margaret wasn't just hitting the right notes. She was interpreting the music, bringing out its emotional depth and subtle nuances. This was professional-level playing, exactly as Gerald Morrison had testified. But Margaret was just getting started. As the nocturne ended, she transitioned seamlessly into the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. This was a piece she had performed with the Moscow Philharmonic when she was 10 years old. One of her greatest triumphs as a child prodigy, the Rachmaninoff Concerto was infinitely more challenging than the Chopin. It required power, precision, and incredible technical skill. The opening theme was bold and dramatic, with sweeping runs and thunderous chords that seemed impossible for someone of Margaret's small stature to produce. But as Margaret's hands moved across the keyboard, something magical happened. The shabby conference room disappeared. The fluorescent lights became concert hall spotlights. The old upright piano became a magnificent Steinway grand. And Margaret Chun, the invisible janitor, became Maria Magdalena Chernova, the celebrated child prodigy. Once again, her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and accuracy. Every note was crystal clear, every phrase perfectly shaped. She played from memory, her eyes closed, completely lost in the music that had defined her childhood. The sound that emerged from the old piano was so beautiful, so emotionally powerful, that several people in the room forgot to breathe. Judge Coleman had presided over thousands of court proceedings, but she had never experienced anything like this. The music filled the room with such intensity that it seemed to transform the very air around them. This wasn't just a piano demonstration. It was a transcendent artistic experience happening in the most unlikely possible setting. Harold Fleming stared at Margaret's hands in complete shock. The technical demands of the Rachmaninoff were staggering. Professional pianists spent years preparing to perform this piece with an orchestra. Margaret was playing it from memory on an out-of-tune upright piano after not touching a keyboard for months. It should have been impossible. As the music built toward its climactic moments, Margaret's entire body became involved in the performance. She swayed with the rhythm, her face reflecting every emotion in the music. Her hands moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades at the highest levels of classical performance. The courtroom stenographer stopped typing and simply listened. The bailiff, who had heard every kind of testimony imaginable, stood transfixed by the doorway. Even Jennifer Walsh, the prosecutor who had been trying to convict Margaret, found herself moved to tears by the beauty of the performance. But it was the jury's reaction that mattered most. Every single juror sat in stunned silence, their earlier skepticism completely dissolved. They were witnessing something extraordinary, the resurrection of an artist who had been buried alive by circumstances beyond her control. Dorothy Kim understood now why Margaret had been so reluctant to reveal her past. Carrying this level of talent while working as a janitor must have been unbearable. Every day of her life for the past 40 years had been a reminder of what she had lost, what she could have been. Harold Fleming felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine humility. His confident dismissal of Margaret's claims now seemed not just wrong, but cruel. He had judged her based on her current circumstances, never imagining that those circumstances might be the result of forces beyond her control. As Margaret reached the final passages of the concerto, her playing became even more intense. This was her moment to reclaim everything that had been taken from her, to prove that Maria Magdalena Chernova had never really died. The music poured out of her like water from a broken dam, 40 years of silence finally breaking free, the last Notes of the Rachmaninoff hung in the air for several seconds after Margaret's hands left the keys. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes and looked around the room. The walk back to the main courtroom felt like a journey between two different worlds. Margaret's hands were still trembling, not from fear this time, but from the electricity of having touched music again after so long. She could feel the eyes of everyone around her, but their expressions had completely changed. Where once she had seen skepticism and dismissal, now she saw amazement, respect, and something that looked almost like reverence. Harold Fleming walked behind the group in complete silence. His mind was reeling from what he had just witnessed. In his 61 years, he had built his fortune on being able to read people quickly and accurately. He prided himself on seeing through false claims and spotting lies from a mile away. But he had been utterly, spectacularly wrong about Margaret Chun. The businessman in him understood the implications immediately. His public challenge that morning had been recorded by the court stenographer. His exact words were part of the official record. If this woman can actually perform piano at a professional level, I'll retire from my position and donate my entire fortune to charity. There was no ambiguity in what he had said, no wiggle room for interpretation. As they re-entered the courtroom, word of what had happened upstairs spread quickly through the gallery. People who had left during the recess were hurrying back to their seats. Court employees who had never shown interest in a trial before were finding excuses to linger in the hallway. The story of the janitor, who played like a concert master, was already becoming courthouse legend. Judge Coleman called the court back to order, but the atmosphere was completely different from the morning session. The jury filed back to their seats with stunned expressions. Several jurors were still wiping tears from their eyes. Dorothy Kim looked at Margaret with a mixture of admiration and sadness, understanding now the tragedy of a life spent hiding such extraordinary talent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Coleman announced, "you have now heard all the evidence in this case. We will proceed with closing arguments, after which you will deliberate and reach a verdict." Jennifer Walsh stood up for the prosecution's closing argument. As an experienced lawyer, she knew when a case was lost, but she had a professional obligation to present her client's position one final time. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice lacking its earlier confidence, "I want to acknowledge that we have learned remarkable things about the defendant's background today. Miss Chun clearly possesses extraordinary musical talent, and her personal story is both moving and inspiring." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "However, talent and personal circumstances do not excuse breaking the law. The facts remain unchanged. Miss Chen entered the conservatory's concert hall after hours without permission and used a valuable instrument that did not belong to her. Regardless of her musical abilities, these actions constitute trespassing and unauthorized use of property." Jennifer's argument was technically correct, but it felt hollow after Margaret's performance. The prosecutor could see in the jurors' faces that their perspective on the case had fundamentally shifted. What had seemed like clear criminal behavior that morning now appeared to be something much more complex and human. "The law exists to protect property and maintain order," Jennifer continued, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. "If we excuse criminal behavior because someone has a sad story or special talents, we undermine the very foundation of our legal system." She sat down quickly, knowing that her words had fallen flat. The jury wasn't thinking about legal technicalities anymore. They were thinking about a woman who had lost everything but somehow kept her music alive in her heart for 40 years. Thomas Rivera stood up for the defense's closing argument. The young lawyer felt more confident than he ever had in a courtroom. The evidence had spoken for itself in ways that no legal argument could match. "Members of the jury," he began, "this case is about much more than trespassing or property damage. It's about the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. Yes, Margaret Chun entered that concert hall after hours. Yes, she played a piano that belonged to someone else. But why did she do it?" Thomas walked closer to the jury box, his voice growing more passionate. "Margaret didn't break into that building to steal anything. She didn't damage any property. She didn't hurt anyone. She simply needed, for one night, to remember who she used to be. He pointed toward Margaret, who sat with her hands folded, looking smaller than ever despite what they had all just witnessed. For 45 years, Maria Magdalena Chernova has been buried alive. A child prodigy who could have been one of the greatest pianists of her generation was forced to become invisible, to deny her gifts, to pretend that the most important part of herself didn't exist. Several jurors nodded along with his words. They understood now that Margaret's actions weren't criminal in any meaningful sense. They were human, understandable, and ultimately forgivable. That night in October, something broke inside Margaret. Maybe it was hearing that student butcher a piece of music she loved. Maybe it was the knowledge that her memory is starting to fade and she might lose even her musical memories. Whatever it was, she couldn't help herself. She had to touch those. Keys one more time, Thomas's voice softened. What you witnessed upstairs wasn't just a piano performance. It was a resurrection. For 20 minutes, Margaret was able to be who she really is, who she's always been underneath the uniform and the circumstances. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that extraordinary things can exist in the most ordinary places. He turned to look directly at Harold Fleming. This case has taught us all something important about making assumptions based on appearances. Margaret Chun may clean buildings for a living, but she is also one of the most gifted musicians any of us will ever encounter. Both things are true and both things matter. Thomas concluded his argument and sat down. The courtroom was completely quiet except for the sound of the air conditioning system cycling on and off. Judge Coleman addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard all the evidence and arguments in this case. You must now deliberate and reach a unanimous verdict on the charges of criminal trespassing and destruction of property. Please remember that your decision must be based on the law and the evidence, not on emotion or sympathy. But as the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, everyone in the courtroom knew that the law and the evidence pointed in only one direction. Margaret's performance had proved beyond any doubt that she was exactly who she claimed to be, and that her actions on that October night were not criminal but deeply, profoundly human. Harold Fleming remained in his seat as the other jurors headed toward the deliberation room. He stared at Margaret for a long moment, then stood up and walked over to where she sat with her lawyer. "Miss Chun," he said quietly, his voice completely different from the arrogant tone he had used that morning. "I owe you an apology, a profound apology. I judged you based on your clothes, your job, your circumstances. I never could have imagined what I heard upstairs." Margaret looked up at him, seeing for the first time not an enemy but a man who was genuinely humbled by what he had experienced. "Mr. Fleming," she said softly, "you don't need to apologize. You saw what everyone sees when they look at me. I've spent 40 years making sure that's all anyone could see." Harold shook his head. "That's not an excuse for my behavior. I was cruel and dismissive. Worse, I was confident in my ignorance." He paused, then continued. "I made a promise this morning. A public promise, and I intend to keep it." The jury deliberation lasted exactly 15 minutes. When they returned to the courtroom, Dorothy Kim was crying again. Harold Fleming stood with the rest of the jurors, but his face was pale and serious. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Coleman asked. "We have, Your Honor," Dorothy replied, since Harold had stepped down as foreman after his outburst. "On the charge of criminal trespassing, how do you find? Not guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of destruction of property, how do you find? Not guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in applause. Margaret collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed with relief. Thomas Rivera hugged his client, tears streaming down his face. Even Jennifer Walsh smiled and nodded approvingly at the verdict, but the most dramatic moment was yet to come. Harold Fleming stood up and asked permission to address the court. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the now quiet courtroom, "this morning I made a public promise. I said that if Ms. Chen could prove her musical abilities, I would retire from business and donate my entire fortune to charity. I am a man of my word." He turned to face Margaret directly. "Miss Chun, you have shown me something today that I will never forget. You have shown me that worth isn't measured by wealth or status or the work someone does to survive. It's measured by the content of a person's heart and the gifts they carry within them. Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. I'm calling my lawyer right now to begin the process of liquidating my assets. Every penny I have will be donated to establish a foundation for immigrant artists, people whose talents have been overlooked or dismissed because of their circumstances. The courtroom was completely silent as Harold made his call.